The Romantic Inn by the Sea by Nancy Roberts. A 19th century shipwreck occurred offshore from where the inn by the sea now stands. He needed to get away from the pace of speaking engagements, even from his much-loved research. 4 days at the luxurious inn by the sea in Maine was to be his lesson in relaxation. He had just flown in from Chicago and was sitting in his armchair at home when Lydia handed him a copy of The Discerning Traveler. "Look, honey, they describe this inn as a romantic hideaway," she said with a warm, inviting smile. "I'm ready for that," said Mark. Driving out of Boston on a Thursday in July, Professor Mark Hardy found himself looking forward to the experience. By afternoon, he was driving his black Cherokee out to Cape Elizabeth along the Bowery Beach Road, eagerly anticipating his wife's arrival. Lydia would be joining him in a few hours. He wished that she had not had to give a test at summer school this afternoon so they could have driven up together. "We work too hard. We must take the time to store up more good memories," she had said. She had read about the Cape and described its picturesque old buildings with her usual boundless enthusiasm. He saw several thriving family farms, spotted 2 state parks on the Cape, and noticed with amusement that the town had taken a former fort and turned it into a recreation area. Mark also liked Cape Elizabeth's red-roofed houses, the lighthouses, and the nearness of the water. Looking round him, he saw much that was typical of New England. His first glimpse of the inn by the sea came as something of a shock. Lydia had given him no idea of its size. It was immense, gray, shingled complex bordering Crescent Beach State Park. Strolling into the marble-tiled lobby, he was surprised to see the walls decorated with original, oversized auburn prints of coastal birds. A biology professor and occasional birder, Mark's spirits soared. He knew already that he was going to love this place. Lydia had reserved a very luxurious suite. It had contemporary furnishings, a living room with a window wall, a 2-story cathedral ceiling, and an oversized bath with a deep soaking tub big enough for 2. Picking up one of the brochures on the bedside table, Mark saw a picture of an outdoor pool, a tennis court, bicycles, and a boardwalk that he presumed led to the beach beyond the park. He lay down on the sofa to read it, and before long was obeying Lydia's admonition to relax. He was soon fast asleep. When he woke up, someone was kissing him. "I'm here, Sleeping Beauty," said his wife. They had a late dinner on the porch of the dining room, selecting a table with a view. Champagne and appetizers of grilled shrimp served with fig and date chutney preceded a tender duck entree. "Not at all bad for 2 teachers," said Mark. "I like this place. You are a woman of taste." "Aunt Margaret would have approved," said Lydia, whose aunt had left her a small inheritance. The next morning they went bicycling down Route 77 to the Portland Head Lighthouse, took the usual tourist pictures, and lunched at the Lobster Shack. Then they returned to the inn, pleasantly tired. On Saturday they cycled south to see Winslow Homer's studio at Proust Neck. They saved Sunday, the 3rd day of their long week, for a lazy afternoon and evening out on the beach. Carrying a hamper with a picnic supper, when they emerged from the state park, they found not a rock-lined shore, but a magnificent sand beach stretching for miles beside the Atlantic. Mark wandered along near the water, watching for unusual shells and sea creatures. Lydia read a book on the area. She was a history teacher, and it amused him to hear her say things like, "I wish I could go back and live then," or "Wouldn't it be exciting to go through an experience like that?" "You mean like the French Revolution or the San Francisco Fire?" he would sometimes counter teasingly. "Well, what have you learned about Cape Elizabeth?" he asked now, sitting down on the sand. "I found out that the Jordans were a very prominent family here." "I'm sure they were, if they were your ancestors," quipped Mark. Before their marriage, his wife had been a Lydia Jordan. "I have no idea whether these particular Jordans were my ancestors or not, only that they were here in the 1630s and lived through 3 wars, the War of King Philip of Spain, King William's War, and Queen Anne's." "They certainly suffered a long streak of misfortune," said Mark, "but you sound as if it just happened." "You aren't very sympathetic." "I feel sorry for them," she said indignantly. "Just imagine. They had to leave during every war. Then when they did come back in 1715, they were attacked by pirates." "I'm glad they survived it, especially if they were your ancestors. It wouldn't surprise me if some of them were pirates. They settled all along the coast." Lydia made a wry face at him. "Do you think Blackbeard ever got up beyond Philadelphia and New York?" Mark asked. "Of course he did. They say he caroused with his pirate friends at Newport and buried treasure on an island off the New England coast. If you didn't work all the time, we could go searching for it." "A biologist would rather search for rare bugs, my dear, but please tell me more." "Fishing was big here in the 1800s. During the winter, men sailed to the Caribbean islands with cargoes of fish and lumber and brought back sugar and rum. But the best part that interested me most—" "Yes?" asked Mark. "It was the number of shipwrecks off this cape. I began to wonder why people settled here. There were bad storms, and over there near Richmond Island," she pointed, "is a ridge of rocks under the surface of the water near shore. It's called Watts Ledge. I can just visualize fog and ships heading for Portland Harbor, getting off course and wrecking on it. Can't you?" "I suppose so." "Sometimes I think you're not very imaginative," she said reproachfully. "Maybe not, but—" He grinned at Lydia. Unfortunately, the day they had selected to spend on the beach was cooler than anticipated. "It's darn chilly out here without jackets, honey. Let's talk about this back of the room. Better yet, we can go up to the dining room and settle the seafaring history of Cape Elizabeth over a cup of hot coffee and some dessert." Mark was beginning to unwind, and he knew that he had been working too hard. There never seemed to be any time left over for themselves. They went to bed about 10 o'clock, but he wasn't able to sleep. He always liked to walk about when he thought out problems, and he was tempted to do so now, but where? At 11 o'clock he got out of bed, pulled on a pair of chinos, a shirt, and his hooded red anorak. On an impulse, he decided to go down to the ocean. "What are you doing?" murmured Lydia sleepily. "Dressing. I just want to go for a walk." "Want me to come too?" "I won't be long. Why don't you just go back to sleep?" She closed her eyes. The noise of the surf drowned out the sound of his footsteps on the boardwalk. A heavy sea was running, and fog swirled over the dark, turbulent water. He felt its mist on his face. Mark was not much happier walking than he had been trying to sleep in bed. What time was it? Almost midnight, he thought. Lydia would be worried if he was gone too long. It was while he was trying to wipe off his glasses and check the luminous dial of his watch that he heard it. A sharp crack, followed by the noisy wrench of shattering spars and timbers. For a few seconds there was complete silence. Then the night was rent by women's screams. They came from across the water, but not far from shore. Loud shrieks floated towards him, those of women and children, their voices full of terror and the hoarse shouts of men. Mark strained his eyes, staring out at sea. He thought that he could pick out a dark mass silhouetted dimly between the billows of mist. His heart was pounding. A ship had struck Watts Ledge. It was in the direction of Richmond Island, and the calls for help were terrible to hear. Mark raced across the sand to summon help. As he ran, he heard one last piercing cry from the direction of the water, the voice of a young woman. He reached the boardwalk. He almost collided with a shadowy, hooded figure. "We've got to get help," he shouted breathlessly to whoever it was, but the figure moved to block his way. He tried to push past when suddenly the beam of light almost blinded him. "Mark, it's me." Lydia was standing with a raincoat over her gown, shining a flashlight in his face. "What's the matter?" He caught her arm. "We've got to hurry. There's a wreck, a ship close to shore." "How do you know?" "My God, can't you hear the screams?" he bellowed at her. "People are drowning out there." "I don't hear any screams. Just the roar of the surf." The chorus of cries was ringing in his ears. "Mark, stand still for a minute. You're trembling." The cries were fainter and farther away now. Why couldn't Lydia hear them? "I can't imagine what's happened to you. It has to be overwork," she said soothingly as she put her arm around Mark. Perhaps she was right, he thought. They walked back to the inn. "Your nerves are strung tight. Too many deadlines." She helped him off with his clothes. "Can you sleep now?" "I think so." And he did. He was utterly exhausted. The next morning, Lydia tactfully avoided mentioning the incident of the night before. They breakfasted on Eggs Benedict with fresh lobster meat, and afterwards, to her surprise, Mark suggested stopping by the library. "I just want to see their clipping file on shipwrecks," he explained. So now you're the one that wants to go to libraries and look up history," said Lydia as they entered Thomas Memorial Library. Mark opened a manila folder and began searching through a huge pile of clippings. I think I found it," said Mark. "Here's a story from March 1965 on shipwrecks of Casco Bay." The story was headlined, "Schooner Charles crashed on Watts Ledge in 1807. "Look at this. The date the ship wrecked was Sunday night, July 12th. It was a little before midnight when she hit the ledge and began to break up. 16 passengers drowned. It couldn't have been far from the beach. 3 were able to swim to shore. Have you seen the grave of the young woman who was coming back on the Charles from Boston?" "She was buying a trousseau," said the librarian. "Her gravestone is right near Crescent Beach. You should look at it before you leave the inn by the sea." "You know, there has always been a romantic story about that wreck," volunteered an old man who stood listening with open curiosity. "In the years since it happened, people walking on the beach at night have sometimes reported hearing the sounds of a shipwreck and the terrible screams of drowning passengers. The schooner was in so close that villagers at Cape Elizabeth heard the cries for help, and it made a deep impression upon them. Remarkable story, isn't it? Yes, it is, said Mark, a peculiar look on his face. This did not fit with any of his experience as a biology professor. He and Lydia found the gray slate marker at the girl's grave not far from the inn. It read in part, "Sacred to the memory of Miss Lydia Carver, age 24, who with 15 other unfortunate passengers perished in the merciless waves by the shipwreck of the schooner Charles on Sunday night, July 12th, 1807. Yesterday was July 12th, Mark said thoughtfully, and Sunday night. But Lydia hadn't heard. She gazed at the marker as if hypnotized. Mark, do you notice how similar her name and mine are? They're almost the same. I was a Lydia Carver, too, except that my name was Lydia Carver Jordan. I even bought my trousseau in Boston, just like she did. Lydia's face was pale, and her eyes filled with tears. Poor girl, she said. You're right. What a coincidence. I think she may have become a romantic figure after the wreck, and perhaps you are a namesake of hers. He remembered the frightened screams of the woman he had heard the night before and thought about the bereaved fiancé. He shivered as they stood there in the hot sun looking at the girl's grave. Could something have drawn his own Lydia here on this date? The past would never seem as remote to him again. The Inn by the Sea is at 40 Bowery Beach Road, Cape Elizabeth, Maine. You can call for details on booking a visit. The end.